I can't stand the rhetoric around Salvador Allende because he was such a terrible person, such a terrible president.
One particular area of interest for you is tackling the historical revisionism that a lot of socialists have been applying to the Holocaust. Why were the Nazis objectively socialists?
Nazis repeatedly established that this private property could only be maintained insofar as it benefited the collective.
The bordertarian view, as it's called, is considered a veiled form of statism.
We think that instead you should treat it as close to private property as possible. It's like, why should I be a socialist? Tell me why. You can't do it by just saying capitalism is bad, pointing out that homelessness exists, pointing out that the world isn't perfect. That's not an argument for socialism, right? You have to make an argument for socialism. Capitalism is to socialism as water is to cyanide.
My guest for this installment is Benjamin Williams, perhaps better known by his moniker PraxBen. He has worked in multiple forms of media, but he is probably most famous for his content that he publishes through the site TikTok. Regardless of which source he uses for his messaging, however, he consistently delivers painstakingly researched and scathing arguments against socialists, Marxists, and the like. This is episode 20 of Morgan Meets the Eye, in which PraxBen and I discuss socialism in Nazi Germany, the issue of closed versus open borders, and his approach to debating, among other topics. Hello, PraxBen. Thank you for joining me on Morgan Meets the Eye. So first things first, what should people listening in do in order to see more of your work and learn more about you?
Yes, I'm PraxBen on pretty much all social media platforms, or at least the primary ones. That would be Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Well, actually, on Twitter now I'm PraxBen Backup because my original account got banned. But yeah, just look up PraxBen. You'll find me all over the place. I also have a Substack, and you can read some of my works on the Mises Institute website under Benjamin Williams, as well as the FEE website.
However, before we get into anything else, though, I am a bit curious about how you personally formed your current beliefs. So this is to say, what led you to becoming an anarcho-capitalist exactly? Was that a natural result of Austrian economic thought? Did you ever go through a phase where you held beliefs that were actually contrary to Austro-libertarianism? To put it simply, what persuaded you to take on these beliefs?
Yeah, I could give you like a quick summary of my total political journey. I grew up in a Republican family, pretty standard conservative family. And once I started getting to politics, I just felt like there were some things I didn't quite like about the GOP. I thought that they weren't pro-gun enough. I thought that they weren't pro-free markets enough. I didn't like tariffs and stuff like that. And this was just conclusions I came to from doing basic research, kind of reading around. And so I was like, I'm going to be a constitutionalist. I think that sounds better than being a Republican. So I was already, something a little close to libertarian. Then I came across some libertarian groups on Facebook, and I started interacting with them, looking at their memes, getting into conversations with them. And my biggest reasons for not being a libertarian was because I didn't think that you should legalize drugs, and I was pro-life. So I'm like, yeah, libertarians are all pro-choice, and they think you should do drugs. So obviously I'm not going to be a libertarian. But I realized that a lot of those libertarians were in fact pro-life, and there didn't seem to be any major contradiction. And I came around on the drug stuff eventually. I really got into things after reading Liberalism by Mises, which I don't even remember how I came across that specifically. I know I was introduced to Mises through the Mises versus Marx rap, which a friend of mine showed me, and I was like, I want to see more of this Mises guy. Then I came across liberalism, and I was like, wow, this is really good. Maybe I'm a classical liberal now. And then I identified as that for quite some time, and then I started looking into Robert Nozick and getting deeper and deeper into Austrian economics. And I found that there was a lot of contradictions I had as a classical liberal. I'm like, oh, taxation is theft. And then socialists would ask me, so you're against taxation, right? I'm like, well, no, I guess it's just necessary. So I became a minarchist, and I didn't quite buy into anarcho-capitalism, mostly because of law and defense issues. And I had a lot of different specific arguments that I had against the anarcho-capitalist. I would debate them sometimes. But then I met David Friedman through a couple of interviews that I did with him. And he talked a lot about anarcho-capitalism, and he talked about some solutions that he had against Nozick's contentions. And then I also read The Private Production of Defense by Hans Hermann Hoppe, and he actually dealt with some of my contentions in that book, which was quite shocking to read. I was like, oh, I guess they already thought of everything. And then, yeah, after that, I started identifying as an anarcho-capitalist, and I've been there ever since.
Yeah, I can definitely, relate to that. My path to Austrian economics was a bit of a winding road, I should say. In fact, I would personally credit your peer, the YouTuber Anglo-Libertarian, with officially converting me to anarcho-capitalism. And from there, you yourself have certainly supported, my convictions and provided me with some useful techniques and strategies in better communicating and arguing these same principles to others. Now, specifically, I, along with a lot of other people, know you mostly through your content that you put on TikTok. And I know that's just one particular avenue of your work, but I would say it's among your most popular and also most digestible for that matter. But anyway, what is it exactly that led you to TikTok? I mean, I'm sure you know better than anyone else that, not all TikTok content is created equal. And what is it about the nature of this particular site exactly that persuaded you to use it for this content?
Well, so I made political content before TikTok, actually. A lot of people don't know that. I made political content on Facebook, and it was mostly written content, memes, and stuff like that. I never showed my face. I just had an anonymous page, and it built up a good, 5,000 followers, which was pretty decent for political Facebook at the time. But after doing that for a while, I downloaded TikTok for the first time because a lot of people were talking about it. I'm like, I want to kind of see what's going on. I got really interested in a lot of comedy videos, and I was like, oh, maybe I can make some of these myself. And I did. And after doing that for about a week, I went super viral. Got a video with millions of views. It was all over the place. And then a little while later, went viral again and viral again. And I was building up quite a following, and I was like, oh, this is actually a lot of fun. And I just was kind of natural at it. But then I started seeing all these Bernie bros popping up all over TikTok, and they were making all these absurd claims about Medicare for all and minimum wage. And I knew everything they were saying was wrong because I was already reading about this stuff for my Facebook account. And so one day I just made a response video to one of them because, it's right there, right? Why not? And people started complaining, like, why are you talking about politics all of a sudden? And I'm like, yeah, maybe I should talk about politics in this account. So I made a new account, which was Benjamin Politics. My original account was just Benjamin, or like BEAN Jamin. So that's the account I have now, PraxBen. It was originally called Benjamin Politics, and then later on it changed it to Benjamin Politics, and then PraxBen. I guess the answer is I started making political content on TikTok because I was good at TikTok content. So,
Nice.
it was right there. And after a little while of making political content on TikTok, some of my videos started blowing up, and then it just got progressively more and more popular. So, yeah, it was just circumstance.
Right. Yes, I can definitely understand that. So I do also confess that, I myself fell into the Bernie Sanders trap when I was in college, but, I have since, completely disavowed that particular time in my life, and, have since moved on to, a much more stable economic footing. But while we're on the subject of economics in today's digital age, I'm a bit curious about how you think modern forms of media, whether TikTok or YouTube or the X formerly known as Twitter, are impacting society's understanding of economics. Would you say that this is a generally positive or negative trend overall?
It's definitely something that's very difficult to quantify, but typically the main things that I see emerging from TikTok and going into the mainstream and actually being talked about tends to be negative. But it's it's not super terrible, I guess I would say, because it's typically just economic pessimism, as many people call it, right? So economic pessimism is not inherently bad. It can be used for good, but most of the time it's not. Honestly, most of the time people take it out on capitalism, entrepreneurs, capitalists, and so on and so forth, right? But yeah, that's the way I see it. That's from my own observations. It's typically you have a lot of people on TikTok who sometimes they're just pointing out legitimate grievances, sometimes they're making them up. Like there was this trend a while back where they were saying America is worse off today than during the Great Depression. And they used some very sketchy research tactics to come to this conclusion. I actually wrote an article debunking this on fee.org. So if you guys want to see the details on that, you can check out that article. But so very sketchy research, and they're like, oh, look, this data shows it's worse than the Great Depression. Those videos really took off because a lot of people really are drawn to economic pessimism. And then that started going mainstream. There was articles about it. And eventually, finally, the fact checkers caught up. And now if you look it up, you'll find a bunch of fact checking articles. Mine is one of them, of course. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, I can't really quantify it, but if I were to give you any details, it would be TikTok pushes a lot of economic pessimism, and we either have to refute what they're saying if it's wrong, or utilize it for our own benefit. You say, oh, look, it's not capitalists causing these problems, it's the Fed, it's the government, it's these regulations and stuff like that.
I often look at, today's digital age as something of a double-edged sword, in which case we have so many people who have a voice that typically would not have one, which is both a gift and a curse in some sense, because we're hearing from a lot of people that probably should not have a voice, in economics, who we probably shouldn't be hearing from, who are promulgating these ideas that, are very harmful in the grand scheme of things. But having discussed the medium and the format of your content, I think it would make sense to take this conversation a step further and discuss its actual substance. So I do know that one particular area of interest for you is tackling the historical revisionism that a lot of socialists have been applying to the Holocaust for the past several decades. There has been something of a debate over whether the Nazis were socialists or somehow, through a very elaborate twisting of ideas and cherry picking of quotes, that the Nazis were capitalist. So anyway, right off the bat, why were the Nazis objectively socialists?
Well, to establish that, you of course have to establish what socialism and capitalism are, which of course there's varying definitions, but there's a good method to find out what they are at their substance is to find common threads, right? So you have lots of different types of socialists. You had syndicalists, you had the utopian socialist, you had the Marxian socialist, and so on and so forth. Market socialists, Marxist-Leninists, Maoists, lots of different types of socialists, lots of different schools of thought and like sub-schools of thought, so to speak. So what they all have in common is their hatred of capitalism, which is their hatred of private property, right? They want to exchange private property with some sort of collective property, whether it be the workers in a stateless society owning it, or it be the state itself owning it through nationalization. So that's the common thread. It's the abolition of private property. Most definitions of socialism you'll find fit this perfectly well. The Oxford definition There's a great book written in I believe it was the late 1800s by Albert Scheffel. He was a sociologist and economist, and he did a survey of the existing socialist literature. And under his definition section, he came to the same conclusion. What the socialists want to do is they want to take the private means of production and collectivize it, right? So this is very consistent in the literature, very consistent in the definitions, very consistent in what the actual political activists said they wanted, right? So now look at Nazi Germany. They didn't really flat out abolish private property. They didn't come out and say private property is now no more. But what they did do is they took away the rights of private property owners, which is effectively the same thing. So, for example, one of their first creeds was to get rid of Article 153 of the Weimar Constitution, and that was the article that guaranteed private property rights. It's the article that said the state can't come in and seize your property, the state can't come in and tell you whatever they want you to do with your property. And through this, that's one of the ways they were able to seize a bunch of the property of Jewish landowners, right? But they used this concept for all businesses, really. They controlled wages, they controlled prices, they told you what to produce, when to produce it, they told you who you couldn't fire. There are many anecdotal instances of that you can find in memoirs and letters of businessmen wanting to fire workers, but the commissars, the labor unionists would say, no, you can't do that. You have to get our permission first. You have to get permission of this person, this person, this person. They had a very complex system of business organization. And the business owners, which they were now called managers, they weren't even called owners anymore. They weren't to be treated as if they were owners. The business managers had to get permission from all these people to make the slightest decisions, right? And the Nazis repeatedly established that this private property could only be maintained insofar as it benefited the collective, insofar as it benefited the state and did exactly what the state wanted and needed. So any of these private businesses who decide to go after their own private profit, their own private interest, they were nationalized. The leaders were gotten rid of. There's many, many, many instances of this. One of the most famous ones is Fritz Thyssen. He was actually one of the early financial supporters of the Nazis, but he believed the same thing that the modern socialists believe, that they weren't real socialists. So he financially supported them after they took power, after they implemented their 4-year plans, after they put in all these policies that restricted private property owners. He realized, oh, all of my power has been taken away as a capitalist. And these guys are basically no better than the Bolsheviks. They're probably going to start rounding up the capitalists just like the Bolsheviks did and executing us. So he tried to flee from them. He was caught. He was put in a concentration camp where he died, and they nationalized his business. So the Nazis very clearly were not capitalists. There's nothing capitalist about any of this. And, you could go into far more detail, lots of different individual stories, individual policies. You could look into Hitler's specific economic beliefs. I really recommend, if anyone wants to do that, Hitler's National Socialism by Rainer Ziedelman. It's a really excellent book looking into Hitler's actual ideology. And if you want to look into the economic system, check out The Vampire Economy, which is published by the Mises Institute and was originally published in the 30s by a Marxist economist who lived under the Nazi regime.
There tends to be a tendency on the socialists' part to play some type of semantics game, twisting certain words around for their own purposes. For example, Nazi Germany was very explicitly a centrally planned economy. For example, I do know that as part of Hitler's 4-year plan, he did organize a high-level government agency called the Central Planning Board, which was headed by Albert Speer. And this focused on a total German economic overhaul. And this is also not to mention Hermann Goering's conglomerate Reichswerk, where a state-controlled organization acted in direct opposition to the interests of private business in regards to the steel and iron ore industries. And furthermore, if we're talking about parallels between, the the Holocaust and Soviet Russia, I do see that, concentration camps are functionally not that different from gulags in one sense. But basically, despite what you've really laid out here, there are a lot of communists who are going to dig in their heels. So basically, I've done some research on what arguments, the socialist community offers to try to distance themselves from the Nazis and try to rebut them. So I figured I could just repeat, some of these specific claims to you so you can provide a rebuttal to them in turn. So first off, and this is actually just something I was reading in my own leisure time, I do actually recall reading the magazine Jacobin a while back, and they did publish an interview with Ishay Landa. He's a writer who has some very obvious Marxist sympathies. But anyway, Landa wrote this book, The Apprentice's Sorcerer, Liberal Tradition and Fascism, which not only attempts to dismiss the claim that Nazis were socialist, but also tries to paint Nazi Germany as the result of free market capitalism. So just getting started with some of the claims he was making in this interview that I was reading, he did argue that, Hitler was a strong supporter of social Darwinism, and that capitalism reflects social Darwinism due to its laissez-faire structure. Now, putting aside the fact that Nazi Germany is hardly what any sensible person would call a laissez-faire system, there are some people who do argue that since the Nazis' eugenics program was a form of social Darwinism, and since social Darwinism is an integral form of capitalism, the Nazis were therefore acting according to capitalism. So how would you respond to this particular argument?
Well, another great way to determine if the Nazis were socialist is to compare them to the socialist of their time, or even the socialist of previous times, previous years, right? If you do that, you find that there's no contradiction here. This is what the socialists believe. This is what the leftists believe. They believed in this form of social Darwinism. They believed in eugenics. They overwhelmingly believed in eugenics. Eugenics was a very progressive, illiberal movement, specifically from left-wingers. George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw was one of the founders of the Fabian Socialists. He was a huge fan of eugenics, as was his friend Sidney Webb, another Fabian socialist. George Bernard Shaw advocated for killing people with gas, humanely. He loved killing, actually. He was a big fan of killing. He said that once the socialist society is established, if workers don't listen, if they show up to work late, if they refuse to work, then you just shoot them. And his exact quote was, kill, 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 kill them. He said kill like 6 or 7 times in a row. He really liked killing, right? And especially when it came to eugenics, he thought that you should wipe out all mentally and physically disabled people. Like I said, using gas oftentimes. Again, Sidney Webb as well. Look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union established I think it's the Russian Eugenics Society or the Eugenics Society of Russia. It's one of those two. In 1922, I believe it was, they had eugenics programs. They supported eugenics. This was not something unusual for the socialists of the time. Racial supremacy was not unusual for the socialists of the time. Many of the original socialists were vehement racial supremacists. Wilhelm Marr, he was the guy who coined the term anti-Semitism. He was a big-time socialist. He spread anti-Semitism more than anybody throughout Germany. He was a German socialist. And he influenced Theodor Fritzsche, who influenced Hitler. Hitler said that he got his anti-Semitism from Fritzsche. He got his National Socialism from him as well. He was influenced by a lot of different people, but this is one of his main influences, right? You don't find any anti-Semitic utterings from Hitler until he met Fritzsche. So you look at Pierre Leroux, the guy who coined the term socialism. He was a big-time racial supremacist. He hated Jews. He thought we should wipe out the Jews, right? So this is something that was always on the left. It's only been in the past like maybe 60 years that leftists started abandoning this position. So I think we should categorically reject the idea that socialism is contradictory to eugenics or racial supremacy, because that's quite literally what it was founded upon. And as for capitalism and social Darwinism, um, this idea of social Darwinism is typically portrayed in a way that it's saying life is a struggle and the strong have to win. And if the strong are going to win, you can't help out the weak. The weak have to die out, right? So the idea of helping weaker, whether it be disabled or poor people, would be contradictory to this idea of social Darwinism that people are typically talking about. But there is some disagreement on whether or not that's truly what social Darwinism actually was in the first place, especially going back to Darwin himself. And that actually that reminds me of something that Mises wrote. I think this is in Human Action, where he talks about social Darwinism. Here we go. Perfect. So he says, the notion of the struggle for existence, as Darwin borrowed it from Malthus and applied it to his theory, is to be understood in a metaphorical sense. Its meaning is that a living being actively resists the forces detrimental to its own life. The resistance, if it is to succeed, must be appropriate for the environmental conditions in which the being concerned has to hold its own. And then he goes on to say, it need not always be a war of extermination, such as in the relations between men and morbific microbes. Reason has demonstrated that for man, the most adequate means of improving his condition is social cooperation and division of labor. So social cooperation and division of labor, if you read Mises or any of the Austrian economists, is an integral part of capitalism, right? Pushing people down or ignoring the weak, ignoring the poor is not compatible with capitalism. So this social Darwinism of Hitler, of George Bernard Shaw, of all the socialists is completely incompatible, especially with Mises's version of capitalism.
One of the key takeaways, like I was saying, is that there is, this tendency to play games with semantics. To give you one example of this, going back to Ishay Landa's interview in Jacobin, he does outright define capitalism as an anti-democratic economic structure, and that as such it means domination over workers, in his words. Now, for example, if we look at the book, let's say, William Shire's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, for example, I know that that's been cited by both socialists and capitalists as evidence of where Hitler's economic preference lay. I mean, Hitler did state, in their words, that private enterprise cannot be maintained in the era of democracy. And I do believe that's the quote. And as a fan of Hans Hermann Hoppe, I would have to agree with that statement to a certain extent. But basically, going back to what I was saying, as far as this twisting of language, if we look at these certain examples here, a lot of critics will lean on this argument that when the Nazis said X, they actually meant Y, in arguments such as that. So a common example of this is that by socialist, the National Socialists were actually referring to intervention strictly on behalf of big business, supposedly, even though we've already established that that's clearly not really the case. The socialists were intervening on behalf of the big business, and while Hitler did speak ill of Marx in Mein Kampf, there are some figures today, such as Ishay Landa, who try to claim that he was in fact condemning socialism itself rather than Marxism. So what evidence would you provide to point out that he is in fact criticizing Marxism specifically, as opposed to socialism in general?
I mean, just read what he said. I mean, he never attacked socialism. Hitler didn't attack socialism even once. He attacked Bolshevism and he attacked Karl Marx and Marxism, and he always labeled them as such. He never said any bad words against socialism. He always said positive things about socialism. He said, "We are socialist." If you read it's very hard to find, but you can find it if you look hard enough. His speech, "Why We Are Anti-Semites," one of his reasons for why they're anti-Semites is because they're socialist. And he said, you can't be a socialist and not be anti-Semitic. Of course, like I just pointed out a couple minutes ago, heavily inspired by Wilhelm Marr, Theodor Fritzsche, socialist anti-Semites. Fritzsche wrote a book about why you should be an anti-Semite, and then he wrote another book, why you should be a socialist. So, this was I'm getting a little bit off topic, I guess, but so that was his legacy. The modern socialists, the Marxists, and the Nazis both did a lot of twisting of language. Also, like I said earlier, they would say like, oh, we're pro private property. It's just that the private property has to do whatever the state wants, right? It's not private property. You're twisting language.
Yes.
And then the Marxists latch on to that same language, right? So the way to actually deal with this debate when people are twisting language is to just be objective, look at what actually happened and point that out to them. They can't really keep arguing that they weren't socialists, which, number one, of course, they never condemned socialism, but they can't keep arguing that they weren't socialist if all of their policies were socialist, if you're able to prove that. And there's a lot of evidence showing that that's the case.
Okay, yes. If you will indulge me, one more case that Ishay Landa tries to make on behalf of, the Nazis, in fact, being capitalist. I have seen some thinkers such as Landa, though I am using the term thinkers pretty loosely here, try to argue that the Nazis were socialists in name only, which they allegedly took on strategically to win over the working class. And Landa has, for one, claimed that the Nazis were extremely capitalist in terms of policies and dismissed the amount of state intervention in the economy on the grounds that this intervention was on behalf of big business. I know he argued that Nazis placed tremendous emphasis on private property and free competition, which I think is hilarious. But then he moves the goalposts when confronted with the many cases of state intervention in the economy by saying that almost every state was intervening at that time in history, in his words, to save the capitalist system from itself. And he then goes on to compare what was going on globally during this era in history to the big bank bailouts of 2008. So basically, to summarize this in more straightforward terms, many socialists nowadays will argue that Nazi Germany was capitalist because, despite all of the state intervention that took place there, they allege that the state was working in tandem with industry. They'll cite certain businesses such as IG Farben, for example. The capitalists supposedly, according to idiots, demanded that the state intervene in order to steer the economy towards the interests of big business. So how would you respond to this exactly?
Well, I mean, it's sort of right in a way, but it's not right in the way he's trying to say it, right? So they were heavily influenced by different types of socialists, including syndicalists. So there was some influence from George Sorel, who Giovanni Gentile described as the father of fascism. He was a Marxist, although he said that he was revising Marxism, and then he created syndicalism. He believed that markets should be separated into different syndicates, right? So you have, for example, like the mining syndicate, or the airline syndicate, and the automobile syndicate, and so on and so forth, right? So in a way, it creates big businesses. It creates these big corporations, corporatism, right? Corporatism, the term that the fascists use.
Yes.
And then these big businesses are, in some cases, directed by the state, or in other cases, like the anarcho-syndicalists, for example, directed by the unions within them, by the workers, right? So, yeah, this idea of syndicalism was creating big business, and it was doing many policies in favor of big business, right? So they screwed over a lot of small businesses in Nazi Germany. They got rid of a lot of them, and they really concentrated the markets into these specific corporations. But this wasn't done to favor the capitalist in those corporations. Clearly not. Like Fritz Thyssen is a great example. He was a great supporter of them, but they ended up having him killed off. because they didn't actually care about his interests. They cared about the interests of the state, of socialism, of the workers. You can fill in a lot of different words there that they would use. The Aryans, the blood. It was never about the individual capitalist. And the some great examples of that are, of course, Fritz Thyssen, that example I provided, but also the what's another one? Shoot. I know they nationalized a one airline company. I just forget what it's called. Peter Temin, the economic historian, he has a really great paper comparing the Nazi economic policy with the Soviet economic policy, and he points out that the reason they were concentrating these corporations was in order for the state to better direct them, not to benefit the people at the top, which were all Nazis, by the way. These were all people who were members of the Nazi Party, and they were in fact working in tandem for the state, but they were working in tandem for the state for the benefit of the collective and not for their own individual profit, because that was actually illegal in Nazi Germany. You couldn't work for your own individual profit.
Yes. And, from here, I also kind of wanted to steer the conversation out of, Nazi Germany and more into other forms of socialism around the world. I do think that it is very much a tragedy that socialism has impacted so much of the world, yet so few people actually realize the extent of its influence. So socialism has had and continues to have, much more of a presence than just the Soviet Union and communist China. This is an ideology that has taken root all over the world to some extent. I mean, if we put Asia and Europe aside for a moment, we can basically point to any country in South America at random and find some socialist or communist influence in its history. Let's take Brazil, for example. There was a Brazilian communist uprising in 1935, which was fortunately squashed. And I know John Dulles' book, Brazilian Communism, 1935 to 1945, I believe it was Repression During World Upheaval. That book is pretty informative on the history behind this event, as well as the Brazilian Communist Party's other dealings during the same time period. Now, although I do think that book is a bit biased in favor of the communists, but anyway, while there are plenty of little-known cases regarding the Communist Party of Brazil's influence over the past century, I would say that the most prominent figure would have to be Lula da Silva and his deeply socialist regime. This is a leader whose actions are directly relevant to today's current situation. These actions may very well have an impact many years in the future as well. He started out as a very popular president. He did end up leaving office, became a convicted criminal due to corruption and money laundering, and has now taken office again as a president, albeit a less popular one. Now, I'm not too informed on him personally overall, though, so I'm curious what your take is on Lula da Silva, his policies, and his impact on Brazil's economy.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with Lula myself. I believe he was in office from 2003 to 2010.
Yes.
There was an economic crisis while he was in office. His proponents, of course, blame previous administration and blame the capitalists or whoever else that they can use as a scapegoat. Anti-Lula people blame him. I don't know all of the specific details about what happened, but there's a big debate. Some people say his first time in power was very economically successful. Some people say it wasn't. I, again, am not too informed about it. I, of course, am very skeptical of his proponents, most of all. But as for his recent presidency, from what I understand, he's not going as hardcore as he did last time, and he's actually kind of favoring liberalization a bit more than last time. Now, he's definitely no Javier Milei,
Yes.
nothing even close to that, and we definitely need to be skeptical of him. But I know he's been wanting to increase investments in the country, foreign investments, and he is currently trying to reform the tax code to become much more simplistic and easy to understand, and things like that. seem pretty good to me, But again, I don't know a lot of details about him. I can't give a strong opinion about him. Again, he is a leftist, so I'm not, I'm gonna be more biased against him. But yeah, we'll definitely see how his presidency in the next couple of years goes.
Yes, I've come across, a lot of similar information to that myself, where he has been portrayed by some people in a positive light. I do also question, how much of these positive trends can even be attributed to Lula to begin with, and as well as what the more long-term implications are going to be of this, as far as what's going to happen to his presidency in the years going forward. But when I think about Lula, he also calls to mind another, society as well. When I look at the positive aspects of Brazilian society that are often attributed to Lula's socialist policies, such as some people cite less poverty, less illiteracy, less unemployment, and so on and so forth. It does actually remind me of a lesser known leader who historically preceded Lula, and I remember reading about him a while ago by the name of Julius Nyerere. He was the socialist president of Tanzania back in the 1970s and 80s, and he has been given credit for positive social trends that were reported during that time. And to be clear, I don't think he deserves this credit. I think that a lot of the upward trends that are credited to him are not only misattributed to him, but misreported to begin with. I mean, as far as socialism in Africa in particular goes, I have noticed that some do argue that Africa in particular does need socialist policies due to how impoverished it is compared to other parts of the world. Whereas there are some people who argue that due to so much abundance in other parts of the world, that's why there should be socialism to begin with. So that's just a side note, though, as to how everything seems to lead to socialism. But there have been socialist leaders such as Robert Mugabe, who was also a Marxist-Leninist prior to that point, as well as Idi Amin in Uganda. But anyway, I do find Tanzania to be particularly interesting because that nation had its own brand of socialism referred to as Ujamaa, and Ujamaa can be defined as, if I check the notes I took here, institutionalizing of social, economic, and political equality via the establishment of a central democracy, in addition to abolishing discrimination based on ascribed status and nationalizing the economy's key sectors. And also, another key part of this I do know was forced villagization. That was a key component of this project. And anyway, some people do defend Ujamaa on the same grounds that they defend other socialist programs, such as that of Lula, citing positive factors such as less infant mortality, more school enrollment, a much greater increase in adult literacy in Tanzania compared to other nations in Africa. So basically, what would you say to people who advance these arguments regarding Ujamaa? I'm not even necessarily referring exclusively to Tanzania, but how would you convince people that these socialist policies that appear to work on the surface will not work in the long term, despite the benefits that they appear to provide in the short term?
Well, yeah, that's always a fun conversation about the trends. It's number one, just reminding people that time is linear. Sometimes people like to just grab a stat from 1 year or a couple of years. It's like maybe look at a whole graph over 50 years or something like that. Actually track data accurately. That's always a problem. Lying with statistics, and you really have to be wary of that. But as far as Ujamaa specifically, yeah, I don't really see why people think that was a success. So Julius Nyerere, he was born in Tanganyika, and he was born in a very affluent family. He was actually born in the chief's family, which many such cases with the socialist thinkers, they usually come from more wealthy families. He went to a prestigious university in Scotland, and there he learned about Marxism, and he decided, some of this stuff about primitive communism kind of sounded a lot like some of the tribal practices back in Tanganyika. And so he developed this Ujamaa, which is the Swahili word for family, the Ujamaa socialism. And when he got back to Tanganyika from Scotland, he led the independence movement, and they became independent in 1961, I believe. And then in 1964, they actually merged with Zanzibar, and that became Tanzania. And a year later, 1965, he's elected as the first president, and almost immediately he starts nationalizing things, starts collectivization processes, collectivizing agriculture. Now, after they were forcibly collectivizing agriculture and forcing citizens into these little farming communities, one thing that we notice is that people did not like working the collective farms. Many people had their own private plots as well, which were much smaller, of course, but they still existed at the very least. And they would rather deal with their own plots than the collective farms. So many of the collective farms went underworked, and as a result, food productivity went down significantly. Tanzania went from a net exporter of maize to a net importer. You saw all sorts of different crops like cashews and other popular crops drop by 50%, right? Then you look at the businesses they were nationalizing in the industrial sector and other sectors. By 1985, half of the businesses they nationalized failed completely. They went bankrupt. And a good third of the rest of them were operating on a loss. They were losing millions of dollars a year. Industrial production was at 10 to 30% capacity typically by the 80s. Nyerere left in the 80s. It was just a mess. Like, I don't see how they could claim this is any sort of success. And, you know, you look at Cuba, you look at Venezuela, you look at North Korea, they'll always try to blame the United States, right? They say the United States put in embargoes, sanctions, the United States was hijacking them. In this case, the entire West loved Nyerere. They thought his African socialism sounded wonderful and interesting, and they're like, yeah, we want to see how this turns out. The IMF was behind him. The United States government was behind him. The Western capitalists were behind. Everybody was behind him. Tanzania was getting more foreign aid than any other African nation, almost more than any other nation in the world. Oh, at one point, over 10% of their GDP was foreign aid. People were flooding money, flooding investments in, and they were getting interest-free loans. This wasn't even like this predatory stuff. Interest-free loans, completely free support, no strings attached, right? And they still failed terribly. They failed so badly that Nyerere had to leave power. And yeah, this idea that this was a democracy is absurd. They had elections, but typically people didn't run against Nyerere. He would win over 90% of the vote, even when he was unpopular. Kind of weird how that works, right? He had tons of political prisoners. At one point, they had more political prisoners than even South Africa did at the time. And he, back to the intervention thing, U.S. intervenes. He was intervening in other countries. He helped overthrow 3 other African leaders, including in Uganda. In Uganda, he was a big-time interventionist. He wanted to start coups and stuff in other nations to implement puppets, right? Like, it's I don't see how any serious, honest person can look at that and say, "Oh, this is a socialist success." No, this is a perfect example of socialism failing because there are no excuses. There's absolutely none. Everybody was supporting them. The U.S. wasn't invading. The U.S. wasn't putting sanctions on them. There's no excuses. So Ujamaa is the Achilles heel of socialism, I would say.
I like that you brought attention as well to the fact that, when socialists will often argue, that try to make excuses, they'll say, well, it would have worked if it wasn't for this country, usually the United States intervening and, stopping it from functioning because, they just didn't want to see a socialist country succeed. Now, in reality, they only seem to pay attention to these types of cases where they're intervening to make it fail. They completely turn a blind eye to these cases where socialist countries are given aid from other countries in order to help it succeed. So it seems like there's a very selective attention, being paid there. Now, as far as, Tanzania, there is another country that I wanted to move on to that has struggled with socialism. And I know this is one that you have spoken on, pretty extensively in the past, and that is Chile. If we look at this very polarizing socialist president, Salvador Allende, we do see that he is hailed as a hero by many people on the left. This is a presidency that saw widespread nationalization across many industries. The government seized well over 1,000 private farms, for example. And I mean, what I'm saying here is that, his very infamous successor, Pinochet, he is widely and rightly condemned as a dictator, but Allende's policies laid the foundation for that dictatorship beforehand. So, for example, if we look at, Allende's presidency, there were still abundant shortages and there was enormous inflation towards the end of his presidency. But still, there are many people on the left who put that aside and consider Salvador Allende to be a hero. So how would you explain to these people who hold these particular, biased beliefs that his leadership was horrible and not really any better than Pinochet's to begin with?
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing, kind of with Tanzania, like we just talked about, that they view this as a success. But Chile, of course, is a much more well-known one. People rarely talk about socialism in Tanzania, but they talk a lot about Salvador Allende. You hear all about it every year on 9/11. They say, oh, there was another 9/11, the first 9/11, and they praise Salvador Allende. You saw it all over Twitter. There was one guy, it was some politician or something. I know Bernie Sanders posted something about it. There were some other people, I forget, some popular figures. They were posting all about praising Allende.
I have seen Jacobin magazine as well praising him. Yes.
Yeah, and it's so odd because well, actually, maybe it's not so odd once you understand what happened. So Salvador Allende was supported by the KGB. They wanted him in power as to form a puppet government in Chile. They supported his election. They funded it. He was an informant for the KGB. He came into power in 1970 on a technicality. He did not win a majority of the votes. He won like 37 or something like that percent. And almost immediately, like, his whole idea is just flip everything around, right? Turn the country into a full-on Soviet vassal state. The Soviet Union started sending them a bunch of aid, and they were, paying him off to do certain things in power. Like you said, he was nationalizing farms, trying to nationalize industries, especially focused on the copper mining industry. And he wanted to completely suppress all political opposition. So he was trying to make sure there were no private newspapers, private radio stations, anything like that left. They shut down several newspapers and radio stations. They jailed and tortured journalists who spoke out against him. And he let Marxist militant groups run through the streets completely unopposed, armed Marxist militant groups. And they would abuse and even kill business owners. And he was totally cool with it, right? If people really want to see how terrible he was, they can read the Declaration of the Breakdown of Chile's Democracy, which was a document presented by Chile's Congress. And this is sort of what led up to that coup. They document how he was suppressing labor unions and suppressing, the workers' rights and whatnot. So, I mean, it's crazy why socialists would support a guy like that. There was a lot of strikes happening because the economic landscape was so terrible. So he was trying to suppress all these strikes, trying to get these unions to shut up. They were using violence against them. He appointed Pinochet. Of course, they say Pinochet's this big evil fascist. Well, who put him in the government in the first place? It was Salvador Allende. And so, like, by 1973, when the coup happened, the entire country is in ruins. It's already a dictatorship at this point, right? Like, the idea that Pinochet introduced a dictatorship is just absurd. No, he just continued on, right? He didn't establish all these dictatorial policies. They were already in place. And this was completely acknowledged by the Chilean government through that document I mentioned. And Allende was so unpopular that a few months prior to that coup, there was actually another coup attempt that nobody knows about. because it failed so badly. A bunch of soldiers are like, we're gonna go kill Salvador Allende. It was a big mess. They ran out of gas on the way there and had to bring their tank to a gas station, fill it up. There wasn't a lot of people involved in it, but once Allende heard about it, he tried to rally the city to get behind him and protect them. He's like, "Hey guys, I'm your president. Come protect me." Nobody showed up. Nobody cared. Literally nobody cared. When the actual coup happened, nobody cared. They hated him. They were dealing with this economic crisis on a day-to-day basis, watching their wages plummet. Real wages fell by like 50% throughout his entire presidency. And that's less than 3 years. That's insane. That's absolutely absurd how fast he ruined things. And this isn't like looking at Milei where they say, "Oh, look, Milei is ruining everything. Look how high inflation is." No. It's the complete opposite. Things were generally improving, and then everything plunged after Allende. It's the trends are completely the opposite, right? So, like I said, the Soviet Union was behind them. There was actually a ship from the Soviet Union on the way to Chile to drop off a bunch of military equipment. And when they heard about the coup, they turned the ship around and rerouted it. Afterwards, we know from the KGB's own documents, which, by the way, acknowledge that Salvador Allende was an economic failure and don't try to blame the U.S. for it. We know from their own documents that they wanted to establish a cult of personality around Allende. And so they started spreading propaganda throughout Chile that kind of brainwashed people into thinking like, oh, yeah, actually Allende did a great job. And we still see the effects of that today because he's held up as a hero. There's a video from Second Thoughts, a big socialist YouTuber.
Oh, yes.
I think it's his video on what is socialism. And he starts talking about Chile, and he's like, Salvador Allende made the wages go up and made inflation go down. Like, what are you talking about? that is that he links to a Wikipedia page. You go on there and it says the exact opposite. I'm like, where do you get this stuff? It's just such nonsense. They think he has to be a hero because these seeds were planted everywhere by the KGB. Everyone wants to talk about the CIA. They never want to talk about the KGB. So I can't stand the rhetoric around Salvador Allende because he was such a terrible person, such a terrible president, but they continuously praise him.
Yes. I mean, at this point, I almost feel like it's beating a dead horse, since it seems as though each example we speak on of socialism seems to keep leading to the same outcome. But I mean, at this point, yes, I do see, Salvador Allende as really a total failure, and and I am glad that you drew that parallel between him and Milei, as the fact that these are two very different situations here. I mean, this is when people are talking about Milei. I mean, Argentina was in a massive economic crisis before he took office, and we're really just seeing that trend continue because it's not something that would naturally change overnight. Although he has already made some great leaps and bounds towards correcting the situation. So, really, there's just one question I kind of want to ask you about socialism in itself, just as the way it's viewed today. I do know that a lot of people may have a hard time nowadays drawing a line between, politicians promising free college and free healthcare to, let's say, like we were talking about earlier, to mass genocide and concentration camps. A lot of socialists may simply laugh at the idea that they're espousing a murderous, disastrous economic and social system that was actually championed by many people, including the Nazis. Their mindset appears to be something along the lines of, well, we'll just do the socialism part and not the starvation and the murder and the imprisonment parts. And I'm just curious how you would, persuade these people that these are indeed two sides of the same coin. They're almost a package deal, in other words. What case would you make to show people that dictators such as Hitler or Stalin are in fact the ultimate end of the logic that people such as Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are using exactly?
Yeah, I mean, like, for one, the historical evidence, like we just talked about, right? It's like, I mean, you could start at the Paris Commune, actually, but, look at the Soviet Union, right? The Bolsheviks take over. Well, you have the initial revolution, and then you basically had the provincial government as sort of loose democracy. But then you had the Bolsheviks coup it, turn it into a dictatorship, right? You had in China, destroy the government, turn it into a dictatorship. You had in Burma, Ne Win take over the government, turn it into a dictatorship. Just time after time again, they take over, they turn it into a dictatorship, because managing, planning all of these things, that requires a lot of power. That requires you having a lot of say. Like, what do you do when people resist? What do you do when the capitalists, the business owners, or even the workers resist? We've had cases of all of that, right? In Bolshevik Revolution, a lot of workers resisted, especially the government workers, but many different factory workers, many peasants resisted. Like, what do? We have to nationalize all these businesses, but they're not letting us come in and nationalize. They're not listening to us. Kill them, or kill some of them, and say, hey, if the rest of you don't do this, we're killing all of you. Arrest them, throw them in jail. They were killing the trade unionists, the union leaders in Russia. Like we just talked about Salvador Allende, the strikes. He's miserable economic conditions, so there's going to be a lot of strikes. What did they do? They used violence against them. Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara, he shut down the trade unions, right? You cannot control the businesses if you don't exert that power. It's never happened before. It can't possibly happen, right? Even with modern, like, liberal capitalist economies, you see that to some extent, right? You have to have a good amount of power in order to enforce your basic regulations. And what happens when people don't listen to those regulations? You come in and you force them to, or you throw them in jail, or you get rid of them, right? It's to a much lesser extent than in these socialist countries, but like that's the only way you can possibly do it. You're forcing people to adhere to a single will, basically, right? Like they don't conceptualize it as a single will typically, because it's like, oh, it's a bunch of people, it's but no, if it's still leading to a single will, right? If you're saying like the majority gets to say, that's still a single will, because it's not like the majority gets 400 different says on one subject.
Yes.
No, that's not how it works. The majority gets to say it's a single will. And
Very
if
good
all
point.
of the businesses, all of the unions, everything is under this will, then you'd have to have some sort of force to make it that way, right? And it's this idea of controlling people in this way is in the very definition of socialism. You socialize or collectivize the means of production. What's the means of production? It's land, labor, and capital. Socializing labor, what does that mean? It's not like capital, it's not like land, it's not something physical. Labor is something that you can't really separate from a person themselves. That's their own time and effort, right? They're saying they're going to socialize your labor. You no longer privately own it. That's slavery, actually. If you don't own your labor, that's slavery. Now the state or the community is entitled to your labor. If you try to cut them off from your labor, just go off on your own, leave the country even, that's unacceptable, because they are entitled to your labor. They socialized it, they collectivized it, right? And that's why, like, socialist countries don't let you leave. That's why socialist countries penalize people for showing up to work late. That's why socialist countries won't let you choose your own job, quit your job, right? Because that's what socialism is. Socialization of labor. That's the most important thing that we should focus on, because that's probably the most evil thing.
Right. What you're describing really is just the natural result of socialism. And even if people are trying to be moderate with socialism, they're still being moderate with, an idea that once roadblocks inevitably arise, and desperation increases, that's going to start manifesting in very dangerous policies, because you've given people the ability, they've gained an instrument that they can use to suit this single will's demands over an entire population, and it's one that is not going to be used in any responsible manner.
Yeah, I like using what Mises said about water and cyanide. That capitalism is to socialism as water is to cyanide, and I tell people, why should we mix like 10% of cyanide with our water that we're drinking.
Exactly.
It's absurd. Like it works or it doesn't work. I don't get this idea that we have like half and half. It's like, well, why would you have half and half? They're completely contradictory systems. They're complete opposites. Either it works or it doesn't work. It's not that capitalism works, so we need half social. If capitalism works, you have capitalism. It's that simple.
Right. Even though I'm personally not a big fan of Richard Dawkins, for example, there's a quote by him that does speak to me where he says that, the answer does not always have to lie in the middle, for example. It's possible for one side to simply be wrong. And I think that comes very much into play in this economic climate where we're constantly trying to say, well, we can't decide between capitalism or socialism, so let's set up this type of hybrid system. I think the U.S. in particular is suffering from this particular middle-of-the-road perspective.
And as we know, the middle road leads to socialism.
Yes, yes, very well said. But changing gears from socialism just for a moment, I do know that, right now a bit of a hot button issue that's been the source of a lot of infighting within the libertarian community is that surrounding the issue of borders. Dave Smith, for one, has been embroiled in some controversy as of late for his views on solving the current immigration crisis at the border, which some people within the libertarian movement do believe contradicts this movement's view on the subject. The bordertarian view, as it's called, is considered a veiled form of statism or socialism by some in the liberty movement. Now, as for my personal take on this subject, I can understand and sympathize with the bordertarian position, but I do tend to defer to a Milton Friedman quote where he argued that you can't have open borders in a welfare state, or something to that effect. Now, unfortunately, under the current circumstances, that is exactly what the political leaders in this country are trying to do. I would say that we should naturally focus on dismantling the welfare state before closing the border, as if we're speaking in terms of priorities. But anyway, I'm just curious how you defend your stance on national borders. I do know that Hans Hermann Hoppe has written on the relationship between free trade and restrictions on immigration. And so since you're somebody who is pretty thoroughly influenced by Hoppe, what exactly is the Hoppian stance on borders?
Yeah, so really the way I like to say we need to look at it is it's not a statism debate, it's not an anarchism debate, but it's a policy debate, right? We're talking about an actual border policy. There's no open border countries that actually exist. Not any real open borders, right? There's hardly even any that have actual closed borders, right? It's just there's different types. Some of them have systems based off of like quotas or like certain limits, like that for in the case of the United States, I believe we have limits for each country. Basically, like we can only take in maximum this amount of people from each country, if I'm not mistaken. We also have like the what's the word I'm looking for? The lottery system. There's all sorts of different border policies, and so we're not talking about like what's the ideal situation, which would be privatizing the borders, and it's just private property, right? We're talking about insofar as the state exists and state borders exist, how should it be managed? And the Hoppian position is that it's going to be far worse if you have open borders. You're basically treating the borders like the commons, and thus you're going to deal with problems that come from the commons. It's almost a form of communism, right? And it's nobody owns it, nobody can homestead on it, right? It's just free open borders. We think that instead you should treat it as close to private property as possible. Private property is good, right? So, I mean, if it's not privatized, we can't quite privatize it. That's the assumption of the policy debate. So we should treat it like private property and have actual rules. And, one of those rules proposed is that people should get permission from the citizens before coming over the border, right? It's not a closed border position. It's just a controlled border position. So, like if you want to migrate to the United States from Venezuela, get a U.S. citizen to say, hey, I vouch for this guy. This guy's cool. He can come in. I'm responsible if he comes in and starts committing crimes. I'm
I put my name out there in support of him and vouch for him. So, and I think that's a fairly good system, There's lots of different examples where Hoppe and others, well, Hoppe talked about both these things, where Hoppe talks about the comparison between like a private state and a public state,
Yes.
the comparison between democracy
And
and monarchy.
Yes.
Right. And he's like, even though this is a state and this is not ideal and we want anarchy instead, it's going to handle these issues better because it's treating these things as if it's its own capital or the king's own private capital, right? He also talks about this in the context of slavery, private versus public slavery, right? I was just talking about public slavery a little while ago, right? Socialization of labor, right? So the people in the gulags, the Soviet slaves, were treated much worse and had a much higher mortality rate than even the slaves in the antebellum South that were decades and decades before them. So, I mean, you'd think that those slaves would be living shorter lives than the people in the gulags, but they weren't most of the time. Neither of these situations are good, but we're just making the observation that it's much better to have this state that privately owns something or treat it as close to private property as possible than publicly or as the commons. And that's I think it's kind of the same principle with monarchy, democracy, public versus private slavery, and then also the borders.
What you're describing really does echo a lot of Hoppe's explanations as far as his approach to monarchy and, like you said, slavery there, in that, these situations are not ideal. These are not what he strives for. He's just saying that they're simply preferable, such as the case of closed borders being preferable to the idea of completely open borders just completely left as they are under the current circumstances. I mean, my concern with closed borders, for example, is really just one of practicality. If we look at land as property that's acquired by mixing one's own labor with previously unowned land, and if we're talking about private entities homesteading this land, I'm curious as to how the entire geographic border of, let's say, the United States, for example, could be homesteaded. One individual doing this seems absurd, and the idea of just an assortment of landowners all mutually agreeing to set up these large walls and fences barring immigrants also seems unlikely. So my concern is that doing this would require some outside force to step in and seize this land, very much like the state would, and this would mean an unjust acquisition of property without previously establishing a legitimate right to it. So my question is, how could we secure borders around an entire nation without inevitably violating someone's property rights, without setting up some type of a centralized government?
Well, I mean, we already have the government and the borders laid out. So this is specifically a policy solution in the context of the United States. In other countries, you might deal with it differently. Other countries don't really face the same immigration issues as the United States. Maybe you could have an open border in like Liechtenstein, for example. That might work out just fine. But in the case of the United States, we already have the resources. We already have the border laid out. I am not sure of the statistics off the top of my head of like how much private land is actually on the border, but even then, I would kind of push back a little to say like we could have something right past their land, right? Like, I don't really see that being an issue. The people, a lot of people's land was already seized, sometimes decades and decades or hundreds of years ago for this border. Like, I don't see any reason to have like a mass seizure of land in order to control the borders. I mean, we already have a controlled border system, and it works. When our government's actually trying to make it works fairly effectively. So yeah, I mean, I don't see that as much of a problem, and I would like to point out, like, you can point out contradictions in the controlled border position, but that's just it. Like, the contradictions don't matter since we're talking about actual state policy. Like, we acknowledge that there are contradictions.
Yes.
You'll also find contradictions in the open border position, because both positions are when properly stated, are assuming that the state has a border and the state has the right to control that border.
I do know that your view is at odds with another close associate of this, of mine and yours as well, that being Liquid Zulu. And speaking of Liquid Zulu, as you know, as him being known as the great debater that he is, this is where I want to move for the final subject of our discussion. I want to speak on the art of debating itself. So in your case, I have noticed that you are a very skilled debater. You are very adept at communicating your arguments and very thoroughly dissecting and exposing the flaws in the arguments that your opponents put forth. So, yeah, so like I was saying, in terms of debating, I can definitely see certain parallels between yourself and Liquid Zulu, for example. But for the people who want to sharpen their skills in the arena, as it were, what is your approach to debating? You know, how do you prepare exactly?
So fundamentally, you just shouldn't get into debates if you are unable, or if you can't really like put yourself in the same mind space as the person you're debating. Which, I mean, sometimes that can be quite difficult. There are a lot of like really odd people out there, and this is actually one reason why sometimes when I get into debates with really crazy people who make absurd claims, I just don't do it. I just leave it. I'm like, no, because I can't even put myself into that headspace, right? Like, I can put myself into the head of a communist and be like, okay, I heard some things about the Soviet Union was super good and blah 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 blah, and I went down a rabbit hole. There you go. You know, there's some people. I'm just like, yeah. I can't even start there, so I'm not going to debate them, right? So I think that's the most important thing. You know, be somebody who can actually understand your opponent and understand where they're coming from, even though you acknowledge they're wrong. Of course, also understand logical fallacies. That's incredibly important. Take things slowly. You know, don't allow people to just get in little zingers in there and then just abandon that. You know, if they want to make a claim and then move on really quickly, be like, no, let's go back to that claim you made. You know, you prove that. You know, can you back that up? Or I have, you know, some arguments against that. You have to keep things slow, make sure you maintain the proper pace, and also don't let people who are supposed to be on the defensive go on the offensive. They try to do that all the time. People hate debating on the defensive. It's the worst, and I understand it's the worst thing ever, debating on the defensive. It's much harder to do than debating on the offensive. Because, you know, people can just use the Socratic method. They can just pester you and pester you and pester you until you know, forget the definition of a word or can't quite, you know, ground this one thing. It's like, you know, it's super easy to be on the offensive if you know what you're doing. So if somebody is, if you're like going after what somebody's saying, like the socialists really especially hate being on the offensive or the defensive. They want to attack capitalism. You know, I made a video on TikTok a couple months ago where I was like, hey, can you socialists convince me to be a socialist? Like, why should I be a socialist? Like, you guys keep criticizing me. You're like, oh, you know, you should be a capitalist. Well, like, tell me why. And I'm like, but I have a few rules, all right? You can't do it by just saying capitalism is bad, you know, pointing out that homelessness exists, pointing out that the world isn't perfect. That's not an argument for socialism, right? You have to make an argument for socialism, not an argument that capitalism isn't perfect. Because I'm not a utopian, so I acknowledge that you can have a capitalist society where all the problems in the world aren't solved. And that's fine. That's how reality is going to be. So just you pointing out that a problem exists doesn't prove I should be a socialist. It doesn't prove socialism is better. You have to make an argument for socialism in the defense of socialism, and they never want to do that. A lot of people were criticizing me for that. I'm like, you guys just like not grasp this? It's a very basic concept. You know, I saw a meme on TikTok where they're like, oh, capitalism isn't the problem, and it goes, well, the flowers are blooming in Antarctica, which is like a whole climate change thing. Like, oh, capitalism's causing climate change. But it's like, and then I see the person's a socialist. It's like, what? So if capitalism is the problem, that means we should be socialists. But like socialist countries were much worse for the environment. You know, you're not making an argument for socialism. You're just trying to criticize capitalism, just going on the offensive. So yeah, never let people flip that around on you. If they try to do that, call them out. and get things back on track. Don't let people like drag you all over the place. You should be the one dragging. Don't let them drag you.
For me personally, I'm definitely nowhere near as skilled of a debater as you are. My technique has always been, the world is a big place. There's a lot of information out there, and you should absolutely, gather as much as you possibly can prior to it. In any case, both supporting you and what your opponent may very well try to cite in advance. But like I said, that's still that's pretty simplistic. Like I said, I'm definitely not on your level as far as debating.
Oh, yeah, I mean
But
that's a very important thing as well. I entirely agree with that. If you and that's kind of related to the first point I made. If you truly want to understand your opponent, sometimes you have to go out and do the research. You have to know what they're going to bring up, what arguments they're going to bring up, and if it requires sources, articles, papers, books, then you should have some familiarity with that. If you can't debate a Marxist if you have no familiarity with Marxism, and if you're going to debate somebody who's going to argue that the Soviet Union is good, you should be familiar with the arguments that they're going to make. So, that's an argument I'm very familiar with. So they bring up these sources. I'm like, yeah, I already knew that you were going to bring this up because all of you do it, and I'm familiar with it. And let me explain to you why it's wrong. Let me explain to you how I know you didn't even read it, and so on. So yeah, I mean, if you know your stuff, then people are just going to constantly embarrass themselves against you.
Yes. I mean, it is certainly, like I was saying, it is certainly one thing to make a strong case for your side, but I would argue that that's, like I was saying, that's only half the battle. I mean, we do have to be able to respond to opponents as well, and this is what I would say. Yeah, that's really what I would say separates the men from the boys on the debate stage. If one were to debate a socialist, for example, they would have to respond to potential arguments a socialist might issue in advance. And in other words, as I see it, a debater would have to know the issue inside and out from virtually every angle and perspective. But like you're getting into, as somebody who has debated so many socialists on these matters over the years, just one final question I'd like to ask is, what are the common flaws that you see in your opponent's arguments? What are the most common flaws? What are the roads that they often go down? And the ones that are so easy for you to, call them out on at this point, since you've seen it on so many occasions?
Well, I mean, the big one is the one I just mentioned, that they want to just attack capitalism and not defend socialism, make actual arguments in favor of socialism. That's the absolutely number one, top of the list, because that's what every single one of them are going to do. In terms of other flaws, it's going to vary by the type of socialist you are talking to. It's I guess if I were to give a second one, it might be that they never really seek out to understand the data they're citing. So they'll cite paycheck to paycheck, that they love that one, or the wage productivity gap and stuff like that. And they'll send headlines and stuff like that, but they don't really take the time to understand all of these things. And that's a huge advantage, something you can take advantage of, because you can go out and read the common citations that they have and find the flaws in them, or find that how they misrepresent them. And when you're talking to somebody, you can bring all this up. Well, actually, I guess another really big one is the assumption of evil or malicious intent. That's a issue that a lot of people have, though. But it's definitely very prevalent amongst the socialists. So, the first point I made on debating is to be able to understand where they're coming from. They don't understand where they think we genuinely want a feudalist society, and we think we're going to be kings in it, and we want to slaughter the workers and whip them and stuff. They're kind of delusional in that way. So that is a big problem you run across. Then it was like, oh, you must be getting paid to be against socialism or communism. You're getting paid off. There's a lot of different accusations that come from that basic assumption of it's bad faith is what it is fundamentally. It's bad faith, and they're assuming that you're always in bad faith. So that I would probably put that as number two, actually. So number one is they only like to be on the offensive, and number two is that they can't put themselves in your shoes.
These are very weak tactics argumentatively that, these people deserve to be called out on and should absolutely, continue to be called out on going forward, because, that's really the only way I see that we have any hope of truly changing minds here, is to basically point out to these people where exactly their arguments are going off the rails. And in a lot of these cases, these people still probably won't change their minds because they're just too firmly, their feet are just too firmly set in these beliefs. But in any case, though, I think that, what you've given me here, I think you've given us a lot of great information here today, PraxBen, as far as addressing these arguments and as far as informing us about, socialism over the world and many other issues relating to libertarianism. So I do want to thank you very much for coming on to this show. Thanks for appearing, and thanks to everybody out there for tuning in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. Make sure to follow PraxBen and myself on social media. Subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. Everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.